Alright, disclaimer. This is a personal YouTube channel. Any views or opinions represented in this YouTube channel are personal and solely belong to me as the owner and do not represent those people, organizations, or institutions that I or may not be associated with in professional or personal capacity unless explicitly stated. Any views or opinions are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or any individual.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our class. There are only a few of us, but it's already 7:16 on my clock. It's enough time to wait for the others. I think we should start ahead. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Today we will be discussing Philippine environmental policy making. Basically, these are the outline of our topic. We will discuss today, I think we will only be able to discuss the part 1 and the part 2 of this unit. So, we will be discussing, of course, the introduction, the overview of environmental policy in the Philippines. And we will also be discussing the importance of it. Why is it that the environmental policy making is important? At the same time, we will be discussing the historical background, basically the evolution of environmental policy in the Philippines, and the key milestones and legislations. Maybe we can still discuss the other parts. We will see. We'll check our time after the second part of this unit. But in the coming weeks, we'll be discussing the current state of environmental policy in the Philippines. So we will discuss the overview of the current environmental laws and regulations, implementation and enforcement. Of course, the gaps and challenges. How come at some point this is not perfectly implemented? And then, of course, we will be discussing the key players in environmental policy making, which is, of course, the government agencies, which is the regulating body or the implementing body of the environmental laws and policies, the non-government organizations, which can also propose a certain environmental law or environmental policy. Of course, the private sector, which is part of the stakeholders, and of course, the civil society, which are the citizens per se. We will also be discussing the policy-making process. How does a certain policy gets approved and how does it would end up as a law or a policy. So we will be discussing the stakeholder engagement, which is very important. If you are familiar with EIA studies or environmental impact statements or documents pertaining to EIA, stakeholders consultation is always part of the process, because even if there is a little risk to the project that you are proposing, still this needs to be accepted and this needs to be approved by the constituents or by the stakeholders, by the specific community, barangay, or municipality where you will be implementing your project. And this is also the same with the policy-making process. Of course, policy formulation, policy adaptation and implementation, and of course, the monitoring and evaluation, where the government agency that is directly, which is DNR, basically, that is directly related or correlated with the environmental policy or law, will be the one that will be monitoring and evaluating a certain environmental policy or environmental law. Though there are cases like it's not directly DNR, like for example, our recent policy on DRR, CCAM and DRR. Partly, DNR is part of that, but it's actually the DILG, which is DILG and the civil defense that actually monitors and evaluate this specific environmental policy, the CCAM and DRR. But of course, DNR is still part of that. Of course, we will be discussing case studies where we will specifically discuss what are these environmental policies and programs in the Philippines that were implemented successfully. At some point as well, there are, I would say a lot or maybe a few environmental laws and policies that are not well implemented and was not successful. in which we can discuss that on the lesson learned and best practices. Of course, as part of the conclusion, as the last part of the unit, we will be discussing summary of key points, future outlook for environmental policy in the Philippines, and call to action for stakeholders. So to start off, let's go first to the overview of environmental policy in the Philippines. So basically, we will discuss what do we mean by environmental policy. We will also discuss as to the current state of environmental policy in the Philippines and importance of environmental policy making. So first off, let's try to look at with this video. I took this video just recently, just last year. This is in Mount Pinatubo. I'm just showing to you the video of how I would say beautiful it is. And somewhere in 2013, Congressman Giao, I hope that's the way to pronounce that, he actually proposed that the Mount Pinatubo should be a protected area. Because number one, aside as it's actually one of the, I would say, one of the tourist spots in Zambales and in Tarlac and in Pampanga, aside from that, of course, he acknowledged that even if it's a magnificent and it's a tourist spot, there's always a carrying capacity of a certain tourist spot. And aside from that, since this is considered as a natural reserve and I would say historical, or it's actually even stated in the news that this is a historical significance of Mount Pinatubo because, you know, when it erupted, there was even, I was not born yet during that time, but I've read the news and I've read articles that when Mount Pinatubo erupted, it actually affected the global temperature. It affected the temperature of the whole Earth because of the volcanic ejecta or volcanic ejections from Mount Pinatubo. Aside from that, there were also a lot of communities that were affected. However, you know, after a few years, if you're gonna go to Mount Pinatubo, it still, I would say, looks majestic. So the congressman of Pampanga proposed that it should be protected. This was posted actually in August 4, 2013, that it should be declared as a protected area under 7586. However, in 2015, Senator Loren Regarda actually proposed that in the Congress that the Mount Pinatubo and Zambales should be declared as an ecotourism zone. And at the same time, well, this proposal of Senator Loren Legarda, it was declared as a ecotourism zone. However, fortunately, in 2017, where the Congress of the Philippines reenacted or passed on the RA 11038, where there are a list of protected areas in the Philippines that will be part of the NIPAS, or NIPAS is the National Integrated Protected Area System, or NIPAS Act. However, in 2017, the Mount Pinatubo is not part of those NIPAS. Mount Pinatubo is not part of the protected area of the Philippines. As of today, I actually searched on if Mount Pinatubo is a protected area. Unfortunately, it's not a protected area. However, there are regulations, there are local regulations of Mount Pinatubo as to how they protect the area. Like, for example, you cannot go to Mount Pinatubo without a tourist guide because, number one, for your security. At the same time, so you will be guided as to what to do and what not to do. So in which, basically, it is very important to have an environmental policy, for us to have a regulating standards, for us to have a basis as to how are we going to manage our natural resources. Environmental policy is actually the formal statement of government's intention and plans for addressing environmental issues. if there is a certain environmental issue and there is no formal statement and there is no environmental policy or law or even a local policy, basically that specific environmental or natural resource will be abused at some point, because people would consider it as not illegal because there is no regulating law. So that's why we have environmental policies and laws. Secondly, it sets out goals and objectives, responsibilities, and strategies for achieving sustainable development. If we are going to read on a specific environmental law or a specific environmental policy, there is a corresponding scope, corresponding the implementing rules and regulation of it. There is a corresponding sanction as to what will happen if you will not abide the law. And at the same time, it also gives us our responsibility as to what not to do and what to do. So if we are going to give an example, easiest example would be the RA 9003. It is indicated there that in our own household, we should segregate. And if it's stated in the law, then therefore we need to abide. And that's at the same time a sort of responsibility on our end that we should segregate our waste because it is indicated in the law. So thirdly, it also helps ensure a healthy and productive environment for present and future generations. So if we can only imagine that if Mount Pinatubo, for example, even if how lovely it looks like, how magnificent it looks like, if there is no local regulation or no local policy about going to Mount Pinatubo, do you think it would look like that? Don't you think that maybe if there are a lot of tourists and they are not being regulated, I think there will be a lot of trashes just around Mount Pinatubo? Or maybe if there is no regulation at all, maybe they use the Mount Pinatubo Lake as a source of water, or worse, as a source of an area for dumping waste if there is no regulation at all. So that's how important environmental policy is, or that is what an environmental policy is. Let me give you another example as to why environmental policy in the Philippines is important. First off, it is important because, number one, as we experience, relatively we have the same experience if we're living in the Philippines in the past few years. Basically, Philippines is prone to natural disasters and environmental challenges. I would say a very good example to that would be typhoon. That's why the recent CAAM and DRR law was approved. At the same time, because of these challenges, environmental challenges, government has taken steps to address environmental issues through policies and programs, in which later on, in a few slides, I will give you an example. There are several laws and regulations that has been enacted to protect the environment. Let me give you an example. This is the net change in tree cover in the Philippines. If we are going to look at on the left graph, still a lot of, I would say, stable forest in the Philippines. That's actually around 18.7 million hectares. That is still maybe quite a lot if we are going to put in a ratio, but definitely not sure if I inputted here the map of the Philippines, the forested land area of the Philippines from 1990s up to today. I'm not quite sure if I was able to put it here, but definitely in the past decade, since 1980 to 1990 to 2010 up to today, there is really a decline in our forest cover. There was a gain of 172 thousands of hectare of the tree cover. However, the loss was way bigger than the gain. We lost 472 thousands of hectare, and unfortunately, there are still increasing disturbed forested areas or forest cover in the Philippines. If we're gonna look at on the right side table where figures are in colored, I would say pink, maybe, we can actually see here as to the tree cover loss from year 2001 to 2021. And we observe that yeah, at some point at 2018 to the recent 2021, we were able to at least, I would say, put into a constant, at least it's decreasing at some point at 2021, but at least it's not drastic. Maybe that's the reason for that. DNR is pushing, especially on the Forest Management Bureau or FMB, is actually pushing to implement the different Republic Acts that we have in the Philippines. Number one good example with that is the National Greening Program. I'm not quite sure if somebody chosen already the National Greening Program, but one of the things as well to discuss with the National Greening Program if it's was really successful or not. So, however, because of the data on tree cover loss, the government recognized that there should be a specific law that would only consider, or not only consider, but would help in increasing the tree cover in the Philippines. Since the point here is, if the government sees a certain environmental issue or concerns, the government would try its best to implement a certain regulation, to pass on a certain law that would address this specific environmental concern or issue. And problem with tree cover is there was a problem with tree cover loss, so they decided, or the key players decided to pass on a law to increase the forest cover in the Philippines. Hence, we have now the National Greening Program. And of course, the other policies and other DNR administrative order, which focuses on, I would say, on regulating cutting of trees. So another example is on this graph, which is actually a very interactive infographic, and actually I like it. This website, they have a data of all countries in Southeast Asia, and they indicated there as to what are the different hazards that you can find in a certain country. And I was able to find this infographic, and this is a good evidence that Philippines is actually one of the frequently visited by typhoon in Southeast Asia. That's actually because, we are facing the Pacific Ocean. And on average, we are experiencing 20 tropical cyclones or tropical typhoon in a yearly basis. So you can see there that in 2010 to 2019, basically it's an average of 20. At the same time, in 1970, we actually experienced the strongest typhoon in 1970. That was Typhoon Sineng, or we call that as Typhoon Joan. It was 275 kilometers per hour. The most expensive or the costliest typhoon in Southeast Asia is Typhoon Haiyan, or we call it as Super Typhoon Yolanda, which was in 2017. And that was it cost us of about 2.2 billion peso. However, the deadliest typhoon in Southeast Asia was also experienced here in our country, which is Typhoon Hapyeong in 1881, there were approximately 20,000 people who died from the typhoon. And which means that because of this specific environmental concern that we experienced throughout the years, as I mentioned earlier, there is a corresponding environmental law to that, which is the RA 10121, which was begun and held in 27th of July 2019. So this is a Republic Act, an act strengthening the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management System and providing for the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Framework and institutionalizing the National Risk Reduction and Management Plan and appropriating funds thereof and for the other purposes. We actually call this as the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, or sometimes we call this as PDRRMA 2010, in which, because of the data that we are experiencing a lot of hazards, may it be on earthquake, may it be on typhoon, may it be on flooding, and all types of hazard, because of that experience, the Philippines or the key players creating or posing for a policy, they crafted this policy and was enacted and approved by the president. So this is just another example that in every environmental issue or concern, the Philippine government will act on that and will pass on a certain environmental law to address that specific environmental concern or issue. So why is it again that environmental policy making is important?